Bonsoir tout le monde. Merci d'être ici avec nous ce soir. My name is Jennifer Elric, and I'm the Interim Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Welcome to the second annual Conversations sponsored by Charles Bronfman, which we are hosting this evening in cooperation with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at McGill to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Charles Bronfman, without whose vision and generosity we would not be here this evening. Mr. Bronfman.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and welcome everyone to the second version of Conversations. Last year, you remember, or those of you who are here will remember, that we talked about civility in political discussions. It was very timely then, and this year, wow, do we have a timely discussion. Oh my goodness. All of a sudden, we're in a situation that I don't think any of us thought that we would be forever. Our neighbor to the south is suddenly not our friendly neighbor anymore. Hopefully, things will happen for the better, and that will change. So this year, nonetheless, we are discussing reimagining borders. And it's not only Canada and the United States who have a discussion about that, but Europe has had a discussion about immigration. The Far East has had a discussion about immigration. And of course, the Middle East is doing whatever the heck it does. But we have a wonderful country, a really wonderful country. We are projected. We've been able to build one of the best and fairest nations in the world through our tradition of peace, order, and good government. That has served us well and will continue to. Tonight's panelists will discuss the problems and the opportunities as we reimagine borders. We now confront the challenge of rethinking the longest-standing relationship with our closest neighbor and trading partner. We don't know what's going to happen or how it's going to happen, but we hope that our government will have the intelligence and the wisdom to bring us through this crisis. It's a crisis we never thought, as I said before, we'd ever have to live through, but there it is. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy yourselves. I look forward to learning about the reimagination of borders. We have three panelists, one from Germany, one from the United States, and one from Canada. God bless and good evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bronfman. I would now like to invite to the stage the president of McGill University, Deep Saini, to say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Elric. Bonsoir à toutes et tous. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, welcome to the second edition of Conversations, sponsored by Charles Bronfman. Au nom de l'Université McGill et de son Institut d'études canadiennes, nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue à cet échange important qui s'annonce de plus intéressant. When we inaugurated Conversations a year ago, the aim was to foster discussions that would deepen our understanding of Canada in all its complexity, from its politics and distinct values to its place in the world. Since then, the global politics and political landscape has shifted dramatically, and the social polarization has intensified. In Canada, we are living through an unprecedented time. Our country's sovereignty and indisputable truth is suddenly threatened by our closest ally and neighbor, the United States. It seems to me that there hasn't been a more pressing time to hold these conversations. So thank you, Mr. Bronfman, for your vision that has brought us here this evening. Fostering free and open discussion on complex issues is central to McGill's mission, and importantly, to sustaining a thriving democracy. In the age of misinformation, disinformation, and divisive politics, both McGill's and MISC's commitment to open inquiry and informed debate is more vital than ever. In this vein, we are here this evening to explore the timely topic of reimagining borders. From trade disputes and tariffs to territorial claims over regions like Panama Canal, Greenland, Ukraine, and even Canada. Questions of sovereignty and border control are shaping politics in a profound way. So too are issues around borders and mobility, the focus of this evening's discussion. While economic globalization has accelerated the flow of goods and services and capital, human mobility remains heavily restricted. Since the 1970s, states have imposed rigid policies which have made migration a privilege for a cosmopolitan elite while limiting legal pathways for others. This has fueled stark inequalities between people in high-income regions who enjoy security and opportunity and those from lower-income, conflict-ridden countries who face immense barriers. Experts argue that barriers such as visa restrictions and selective labor schemes have forced many seeking a better life into irregular border crossings. This has come at a high human cost, with thousands reported dying or missing each year. In 2018, the UN adopted the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which recognized that facilitating international migration is beneficial for all. If better migration management rather than reliance on restriction and control would improve outcomes, then how do we achieve this vision? Helping us unpack this complex issue are our three panelists today: Peter Altmaier, Julián Castro, and Ayelet Shachar. We are so grateful to the three of them to be with us here today, and we look forward to hearing your insights shortly. Thank you also to Nahlah Ayed, an award-winning journalist and host of Ideas on CBC Radio 1, for agreeing to moderate the discussion today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Nahlah to introduce our speakers and begin the discussion. I wish you all an excellent evening. Merci et bonne soirée à toutes et tous. Merci beaucoup.
Good evening. Can you hear me here? There we go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, President Saini, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. As host of CBC Radio's Ideas, I'm really pleased to be here to do what our program does best every weekday, to delve into some of the most pressing matters of our time. As President Saini said, at a time of polarization and division, we at Ideas are proud of our 60 years of providing space where meaningful conversation thrives and curiosity rules. So as you know, the time we have tonight is hardly adequate to tell you everything that our esteemed panelists bring to this discussion, but let me at least try to give you a small glimpse. Ayelet Shachar is a political scientist and law professor at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Her award-winning books on migration and citizenship include The Birthright Lottery from 2009 and The Shifting Border from 2020. In 2019, Ayelet received Germany's most prestigious research award, the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize. And in 2024, she won a Career Achievement Award from the American Political Science Association. She was the youngest scholar ever to get that award, and the jury pointed out that her work influences, quote, every corner of our field. Please welcome Ayelet Shachar. Peter Altmaier was elected to the German Bundestag for the first time in 1994 and was a member for a total of 27 years. He's among the founding members of the Christian Democratic Union Party of Germany, the CDU. Among several government and party positions, he was Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, and in 2013, Angela Merkel appointed him head of the Federal Chancellery and Federal Minister for Special Tasks, and that included coordination of the refugee crisis in 2015. Peter Altmaier studied law at Saarland University and completed postgraduate studies in European integration in 1986 with a certificate in European studies. Please welcome Peter Altmaier. Last but not least, Julián Castro is currently Chief Executive Officer of the Latino Community Foundation, the U.S.'s largest in service of the Latino community. He served as mayor of his home city, San Antonio, and was the youngest mayor at the time of a top 50 American city. In 2014, he became the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Barack Obama. And in 2020, Julián himself ran for the Democratic nomination for president. Julián earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Stanford University and a law degree from Harvard Law School. His memoir, An Unlikely Journey, Waking Up from My American Dream, was published in 2018. Welcome, Julián. Thank you all for being here. Ayelet, I want to start with you. A simple and yet complicated question. What is a border?
What a simple question. Thank you, and such a pleasure to see such a fantastic audience here. So borders have two core functions. One of them is actually very traditional. I would not have imagined that I would have to explain this in 2025, but it's very present and important to remind ourselves. Borders have a protective function. They protect the territorial integrity of a given country. It's a very established principle of international law. No country can force another country to change its border, to erase its border, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just as a reminder, given the current moment. For the purposes of our discussion about migration and borders, borders have a peculiar function. That is, they regulate mobility. They regulate who may get in some countries, also who may exit, or under what conditions you either enter, remain, or leave the country, and then re-enter it again. If I asked people in this room, and hopefully people who are listening to us at home, to just think about the image that comes to mind when you think about a border, I think most of us, many of us, would imagine a line on the map or a very fortified manifestation of a border, something like the border wall, US-Mexico, the Great Wall of China. Peter Altmaier is sitting next to me, so the former Berlin Wall. So these are all the traditional static ways of thinking about the border. I think what's fascinating in the past few years, the recent developments that we have seen, is that countries are trying to regulate their border long before a potential migrant actually arrives to the border. So regulation occurs before a person reaches the border, and often from far, far, far away, almost half a country, half the world away, or even after a person crossed the border. If I can give two real quick examples. Sure. One example, anyone who has traveled internationally, say to Canada, knows that your documents are checked before you embark on a plane. So I know, Peter, you came from Frankfurt yesterday. So probably an airline personnel checked your visa, your ETA, your electronic travel authority, et cetera, authorization. It may seem very simple if you have the authority to move, that is, if you're permitted to move, but if you're an asylum seeker, most likely that would be your border. Now, this matters a lot because the person who's actually regulating your mobility is not a government official. You can't seek asylum, although if you manage to get on that plane and land here in Montreal, you could have done that. So that's one way of the border stretching out. Borders also stretch in the way that, I'll just tell you an example from my own experience. I was just traveling to NYU to give a talk 2 weeks ago, and I was supposed to cross the border. That is, Canadians do pre-clearance when we go to the US, so you're actually regulated by customs and borders officials before you leave Canada. And our plane got delayed, and we had to switch to another plane, and we had to wait for an hour for an immigration official from the US to walk with us, because technically we were physically in Canada, but legally we were in the US. So these are two legal fictions or examples of how the border shifts inside or outside the actual territorial border.
Thank you for that. We'll obviously get very deep into the conversation of what the borders are like today. But I do want to ask you, Peter, if we could just take one step backwards and talk about the time before borders are the way we know them today. In fact, there was a time in history where borders didn't even exist. How would you characterize that time?
Well, borders did always exist, I would say. It is a human characteristic to protect the borders. But I cannot see any borders around towns in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age. I cannot see any border without gates. Borders are protective, but borders have also an enabling role. And I was so touched when Mr. Bronfman, in his introduction, said the friendly neighbor across the border seems to be no longer the friendly neighbor. And this reminded me, Mr. Bronfman, that many years ago, when Germany, after the war, was in a very dangerous neighborhood to Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Our freedom was protected by very brave people from Canada for decades. And there are lots of question marks today with regard to the new developments, but there is a strong feeling amongst my German compatriots that we have to be in solidarity with our Canadian friends, whatever will bring the future. And
thank you.
And the second thing with the border is, it is in our national interest to protect our sovereignty, but it's also, and it is in our national interest to fight crime and terrorism. But when I look around in the world, I cannot see any successful country with a brilliant culture and a decent standard of living without interaction with its neighbors, other countries, and other people in the world. And if ever a country would try to permanently close its borders and to allow no exchange with other nations, it would destroy its own future in a modern and globalized world. That is my personal conviction, and therefore let's protect the borders, but let's also keep them open for ideas, for people, for goods, and for services.
Thank you, Peter. Julián, in your lifetime, how has the idea of the border shifted?
You know, I remember when I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and San Antonio is probably about 2.5 hours from the Mexican border if you go down I-35 to Laredo. I grew up in a time where people would cross the border between the United States and Mexico much more frequently to shop, for work, some people for school, Mexicans who would come to the United States for school here. that does not exist any longer the way that it used to. Yes, some of it still happens, but not in the volume that it used to. And so the idea of the border was much more free-flowing, much less of a militaristic line in the sand kind of symbol of stay out when I was growing up.
And it's become a bit more of an identity marker.
Yeah, I'd say so. Although, you know, as a Mexican American, that's also always been layered because people have had family history across that border and still do. And culturally, Spanish is spoken in South Texas frequently, right? Of course, Spanish is spoken on the other side of the border in Mexico, but many of the customs, the music, the traditions are very similar. And so I see culturally the borders in some ways more like a color spectrum that's, you know, changing colors, but not right away, not with a bright line.
As has already been mentioned, Ayelet, here in Canada, of course, the border has been a very hot topic. And after complaints from the Trump administration, both about the movement of asylum seekers and about concerns about the movement of fentanyl, Canada has tightened what is called the world's largest undefended border. There was an article recently in the New York Times that talked about the fact that there is, because of the attempts at mass deportations in the US, that there have been some undocumented movement from south to north into Canada. And so I wondered what tensions you see this creating for Canada, especially as it's having to fend off talk of, quote, being a 51st state.
Well, we'll have to see what the numbers are actually like, but that's, so in a way, this is a crystal ball, we don't yet know. There was a fear actually prior to the current situation. If I can take us back even just a couple of months back, if you recall, immigration was actually very high on the agenda in Canada, and changing the kind of consensus that we have had in this country. So Canada for the last few years has been a real outlier in the sense of still being pro-migration, whereas we know many, many other countries in the world have actually restricted mobility, have closed the border. Canada actually upped the numbers of people that we admit either permanently or temporarily. But in the last couple of months and even few years, that conversation has shifted, and you can see it in public polls that's sort of checking the temperature. What's your view on migration? We have seen a shift, and the public opinion really soured. The sense was that too many people were getting in, and one of the most crucial aspects of immigration, and it's not sufficiently well discussed, is the fact that oftentimes so much of it is about trust. Do individuals have trust in the government being able to control who gets in, being able to know where people are? Is there a loss of control? And I think the sense in Canada was that the government doesn't have the kind of control that it had before, and that, as I said, really changed the conversation. So this was before the new Trump administration, before we had this current discussion about the border and its closure. But people moving from the south to the north was actually a concern. Just given that we have seen this before, we know everyone in Quebec would know with Roxham Road, right? So we had this, the fear was that individuals, especially people on temporary protected status in the US, would actually move to Canada as a safe haven. So we, to some extent, we haven't seen such high numbers, but if this will occur, we could see a very quick shift in terms of public opinion, and I would also assume that the government would take a very, very strong position.
Well, on that, just I want to follow up. Mark Miller recently, who was Canada's immigration minister, said that whatever fallout there is from the latest US crackdown on migration, that, quote, Canada will be firm and fair, we will absolutely not be cruel. I'm wondering how difficult you think it would be for Canada not to be cruel.
You know, borders are in some way, as I said, for people who have no permission to cross a border, to some extent, borders can feel very cruel and it's one of the most expressive ways of a state to exercise its power over the individual. We usually think of such power, say, in a criminal context, but then you have so many procedural protections. With an immigrant who's coming in, especially if they're unauthorized, there are very, very, very few protections. So this would require a lot of thinking how to do this in a humane, in a fair, compassionate way, while also upholding some of the legal requirements. So it's a very, very complicated balancing act. I hope that Canada actually does stand to its promise, which traditionally has been a more humane policy, but it will be very, very difficult. I don't think we have any easy answers, and this is why our topic is so pressing today and most likely in the next few months and years.
Yeah. Julián, it's no secret, of course, how the U.S. administration feels about borders, both north and south. I wonder if you are able to take us to the moment. When was the moment that you think that the southern border became the political lightning rod that it is today?
Probably when Trump announced in the summer of 2015, when he came down the gold escalator and he said, that the Mexicans are coming, they're rapists and murderers. I forget the exact language, but basically, characterized the people who are coming from the southern border as criminals. And then in 2016, used that as his signature issue to demagogue on the issue of immigration, and continued to do that throughout his first term, continued in the years that Joe Biden was president, really weaponized it in the 2024 election. And because we saw very heavy numbers of people coming from the southern border during the 21, 22, 23 years, it was an even riper time in 2024 for him to demagogue with it. So I would say we're going on 10 years now. Now, it's gone through waves, right? I mean, we've seen times like this in the United States before. What's new, I think, is the animus toward Canada. And at least new in the modern era. Y'all know the relationship with more intricacies, I imagine, than I do, and maybe 100 years ago or so, but I doubt it. This is a signature Trump, lunatic articulation, just for him to aim his fire at Canada. I mean, you haven't seen that when we had presidents before that were anti-immigrant. This seems to be just a particular fascination with Trump.
We will come back to that again also in a moment. But Peter, I want to talk about Germany, which has just gone through an election. It has a new government, and it is leaning more to the right than what we're accustomed to in Germany. I would say that's an accurate statement. But I'm curious where you see the control of movements across borders being among the list of priorities for the government, for the new government.
Well, it is a priority, because we have seen over the last couple of years a number of regional conflicts and wars, civil wars especially, authoritarian regimes attacking their own people, and this has increased the number of refugees. Not all of them are illegal, but some of them are illegal. And this is a big challenge for everybody. Germany was in a position in 2015 that 1.5 million people from the failing state in Afghanistan and the civil war in Iraq, and especially the terrifying regime of Mr. Assad in Syria, went to Europe. And then the question was what to do with these people. And we have to control immigration. We have to protect us against criminal and terrorist activities, but we should not fight immigration by giving up our own Western values that made us winning the Cold War. And these Western values based on humanity, on the respect for the dignity of the human being, these values are important, and they are a fire of hope across the world.
So Peter, I want to interject here and bring us to the year 2015, where you were at the center of the decision-making, or close to the center, that allowed people to enter Germany in such large numbers back then. What convinced you? What moment, what image, what thought convinced you at the time that you were making the right decision?
Well, it was an enormous problem when we saw all these hundreds and thousands of people moving. And politicians should take decisions by rational arguments. But I admit that I was touched in two specific moments. One, when a family crossed the sea between Turkey and Greece, Syrian family, and they had 4 children, and 3 of them thrown in the water. And the picture of that was in our newspapers. And it was so devastating. And the second was, we had 10 million Syrian refugees, decent people in the majority. And they had no work permit in Turkey. 4 million were staying in Turkey. No work permit, no health protection, no schooling for the kids. And all these refugees working on the illegal labor market for lousy bad salaries have saved some money to give it to the teachers amongst the refugees to organize teaching for the young kids during their stay in Turkey. Yeah. And it has touched me because then I have seen these were human beings like we, desperate people. They lost their home, they lost everything, their jobs, their families. And then I said, well, if we are as a rich country, as a country who has benefited so much from the solidarity of others, if we are unable to provide protection, then we have failed in history. But at the same time, Chancellor Merkel and myself, we were aware of the fact that this cannot go on forever. We have to integrate the people who are allowed to stay. They have to learn German. Mm-hmm. They have to get a job. By the way, 86% of all refugees who arrive from Syria have now a job. They are employed people, and almost all of them are fluent in German and have learned our language.
So coincidentally, actually, Ayelet was also in Germany at the time as the head of the Max Planck Institute. I was there as a journalist as well, and we've, of course, well remember the scenes of welcoming Germans, helping those people who were streaming into the borders. And we also saw, of course, how fairly quickly, that sentiment changed. And so, Ayelet, I want to ask you, what is the main factor that determines when a population turns against migration?
Yeah, I think we know from some of the studies that with Germany, we couldn't know what the moment would be, but it was predictable that we would see that switch around. You remember there was an event in Cologne, but I think mostly, and here I would actually want to hear my co-panelist's opinion, the concern, or at least as I would recall it, or retell it as a scholar of migration and borders and citizenship, the concern at some point was indeed that more and more and more and more people will come in. And Germany has a universal right of asylum, so there was no legal stopping point. And I think that got people very anxious. And we have seen this repeatedly in other examples as well. That is when there's a very high flow in terms of numbers, when there's not a clear endpoint, then we tend to see this very strong, and it could be a very sudden switch around. And as I said, part of it is perception. It's not that Germany, most likely a strong country with more than 80 million people, with a government that was very much really vested in ensuring that the asylum seekers would at least have a hearing and could stay. Nevertheless, it's that sense of loss of control, and once you get that sense, you'll always have politicians who would take advantage of it. But I really do think that's that shifting moment, and once that happens, it's so hard to bring that genie back into the bottle, if at all possible.
Yes, but if I may respond quickly.
Sure.
That was the sentiment, yes, but if you look at the facts, we were very active to change this flow of migrations, and we concluded as a European Union an agreement with Turkey. All the refugees received a work permit, health protection, and we have spent some money to build hospitals, housing, etc. And then the flow of migrants went down considerably. And then something happened that nobody expected to happen. That was a Russian aggression against Ukraine. And then many million of Ukrainian women and children arrived in the EU, in Poland, and most of them migrated to Germany. And these people are very popular in the country, but the pressure on schooling, on housing, went higher and higher. And this has fueled the support for right-wing and left-wing extremist parties. But The most important root cause for this development was the fact that the democratic parties of the center were not able to agree amongst them on effective measures to be taken. It became an issue of an election campaign, and people expect us not to campaign, but to act and to solve the problems. And that was perhaps the point that was missed by the political parties like my own party and the SPD and FDP and Green Party and many others.
Can I jump in?
Sure, a quick
Nahlah?
point, then we'll go to Julián after.
Yeah, I think actually you sort of made the point that I wanted to make. I think governments need to be very, very quick in terms of responding. Even in the Canadian story, I think the public sentiment had already changed. The government did declare that the numbers would be capped, but it was too late. You have to be really exceptionally sensitive. So I agree with you. I think you need to act quick, especially if you see this shift in public opinion. And the EU-Turkey agreement was already in some way, once it came in, it was significant, but it was also a little bit too late. So this is a message for any politician. You really, if you're dealing with immigration, you have to have such a good read of the public opinion. Sometimes it's hard. And again, there are always people who would take advantage of these kinds of sentiments. So it's very, very difficult actually to act.
So here we are 10 years after that fateful summer, that important summer, and a pivotal summer, I should say. Germany has extended what were supposed to be temporary border controls and land crossings. The Swiss upper house of parliament passed a motion to tighten border controls with its neighbors, and this hasn't been unique. Several Schengen governments have done the same, and the Trump administration, just in the last few days, tried to invoke an 18th century law, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, to enable the mass deportation, specifically of Venezuelan migrants. Julián, some of the restrictive measures that we're seeing today, like those in Germany, are said to be temporary, but it sure looks like the new normal, is it?
I hope not. I mean, that's always possible. I think a few things are at play here that are going to determine whether that's true. Number one, I think that Trump is unique in American history, and I don't think that anybody's going to be able to replicate what he's done electorally to put the coalition together that he's put together. There's nobody that's going to be able to do it as charismatically or as effectively when he's gone. And I believe that he's not going to be on the ballot again as much as he'd like a third term and so forth. Also, we do see it go in cycles. And even in the last election that I ran in 2020, we had Joe Biden that was talking about halting deportations. That was a reaction. The country was in a different place because they were reacting to family separation, the images of children being taken from their parents, all of those stories, the overreach of the Trump administration. I actually think in the midterms of 26 and in the presidential election of 28 that you're going to see that pendulum swing. How far it swings, who knows? But I actually think it's going to swing in the other direction because of the cruelty and the overreach of Donald Trump. And then Republicans are going to have a time trying to replicate what he's been able to do.
Is that optimism, or are you actually seeing signs already of?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's very early, right? But I don't see signs of it yet. I mean, right. We're like 2 months into the administration, so but you do see already a sense of alarm, and that it's woken people up, both, of course, in the Democratic base, but also in the middle. People keep asking the question, where are the Democrats? Where are the Democrats in terms of pushing back? But you do see more of those voices. You saw the anger at Chuck Schumer over what happened with the continuing resolution over there. And so it may be a slower thunder that builds up than it was in 2017. But I actually believe that it's possible that we're going to see in 2026 basically what we saw in 2018, which was a wipeout of the Republicans in the midterm year.
Yeah.
One quick thing that I wanted to say also about this issue of migration and how people feel. It's a very, of course, emotional issue, and it's very easy to demagogue in politics. We also always note, of course, that the people coming in are usually different skin color, different, culturally, and also oftentimes religiously. But a lot of it also, I think, is that people are poor. Where even amongst ourselves in our nations do people, just to put it bluntly, approve of like being around poor people? Think about how many people show up at meetings on zoning cases or planning cases at city halls or town councils and want to keep people who are low income out of their neighborhood. They don't want a low income apartment building or something like that. There's an issue of class that is very powerful.
And this was central to your bid to become the presidential nominee. You talked a lot about this. I wonder if you could talk about the notion of decriminalizing desperation, which you raised repeatedly in your bid to.
Yeah, I mean, I raised that issue because I felt that Trump had weaponized a law that had been in existence for decades but never really been used to basically criminalize parents who were bringing their children, migrants, but really enforced it against parents and then separated those parents from their children. And I said, you know, that we had gone decades and decades without using it in that way to criminalize these migrants. And I thought that we could have a system that did not abuse that law. Mm-hmm. Still, there would be a penalty. So it's not that people would not end up getting into a system and their case being adjudicated and then, you know, the fact is that most people who seek entry end up going back to their home country or another country now with what the Trump administration is doing. But there's another way to do it that is not cruel.
Yeah. Ayelet, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on one of your earlier points, before the point on class, which I fully agree with you. I think when even people who voted for this particular administration, for Trump, probably did not anticipate the kind of, for sure they didn't expect the Canada story. I think no one expected that. Well, I think it definitely wasn't on the ballot, so to speak.
Least of all Canadians.
Least of all Canadians, of course. And we are the ones who are feeling it.
People don't support that either.
Exactly, I don't think there's support for that.
Canada.
But also when the discussion about unauthorized migrants, people really had in mind people who were criminal, who were, like, it wasn't your next door neighbor, which might happen to be a person who has no status. So I think there's tons of room there for building solidarity when people really realize what the implications might be. And I think you might be right that maybe this administration is overshooting, right? They're not differentiating at all. And by doing that, they might really create that counter movement. I mean, hopefully that would occur. Of course, we still have to see, but I think people really, when they think about people who entered without permission, they don't think about the kid who's in the same classroom as their child, or a person who works with them and all of a sudden they learn they don't have status, or someone who's just, they engage with them. So I think if you think about migrants in that perspective as people who share the same communities, it's a very different conversation. And I agree with Julián. Yeah, it could be that someone who entered without permission, at some point there should be some kind of either a monetary penalty, something should be acknowledged in the sense if we want to maintain the rule of law, in the sense of there are certain immigration laws that need to be maintained. But nevertheless, there's such a variation. There's no reason to go to that most extreme variant of these really cruel deportations.
I want to address something you've all kind of referred to, but even in the introductory comments, and that's the harm that can occur at these sort of hardened borders. In an article titled "The Myth of the Hardened Border" in the March 2025 edition of Foreign Affairs magazine, the writer said that, quote, border-first approaches may be increasingly popular and politically appealing, but they are certain to fail and to hurt many innocent people in the process. They go on to say that in 2023 alone, more than 3,000 migrants died in the Mediterranean and more than 700 died along the US-Mexican border. Certain to fail. What do you think, Peter? Certain to fail, hardened borders?
Well, it is a kind of a dilemma. I was dealing already in 2008 as a state secretary with illegal immigration from Libya to Italy and Malta. And then you have the dilemma that traffickers in human beings are organizing the boats, bringing the migrants to the coastal areas of Italy or Malta, and then they make the boats sink, and then the people are in danger of life. And then you have no choice other than let the people drown or rescue the people. Both is unpopular. And this was the reason why we have always said we have to complement our humanitarian aid and the acceptance and admittance of refugees by a policy that will allow them to stay in dignity in the neighborhood of their countries where they have been forced to leave. This was the reason. This was the reason why we have tried to help stabilize entire regions in the neighborhood of Europe, because in Libya, for example, in Syria, and in neighboring countries of Turkey, there was so much instability that these people were prone of traffickers, of illegal migrants. Mm-hmm. And when the people arrived, they lost their money, they lost their fortunes, and they were in danger of life. And then you have to find answers. I agree, by the way, that you have to respond very quickly when you have new developments. But unfortunately, politics can't be very quickly. When we tried to convince Turkey to give work permits and to the refugees and health protection, then Turkey said, okay, yes, but we need 10 billion euro and you have to give it to us unconditional. Right. And then we said, no, we will not give it to you. We'll give it to the companies building the houses and building the schools and the hospitals. And this was, of course, half a year of negotiation and half a year where the issue was not resolved.
So both timely and costly.
Timely and costly, yes, and therefore I believe we should not wait until the next humanitarian crisis arises, but we should act beforehand together with countries in the regions concerned to provide help. And the second thing is, many of our countries, especially Germany, are in need of labor market migration for demographic reasons. And I believe this artificial division between humanitarian aid on the one hand for refugees and legal migration on the other side has as a consequence that we have the legal immigrants we welcome, and we have the others who arrive and cannot be returned for one reason or the other. And therefore, I would suggest to make a combination between the two. That means if somebody is really forced to leave his country and he is a refugee, then he should be integrated much more smoothly into the labor market after a vetting to make sure that he's not a terrorist and not an Islamist. But we have to realize that the two are not completely separated. Otherwise, we will have to pay a higher price and have less security for our citizens.
Julián, you've spoken publicly also about the economic benefits of exactly what Peter was just talking about, the movement of people who might be contributing to the labor market. Can you just outline the argument and why it's difficult to make that argument in the environment we live in now?
I mean, I think in many ways because a lot of people don't want to face reality. In the United States, the reality is that several industries depend in large part on immigrant labor, documented and undocumented, right, and would absolutely fall apart if a plan for mass deportation took place. I don't think that Trump is going to be able to fully carry out his vision. He doesn't have the resources right now, but let's see what Congress does. It may unfortunately give him a lot more resources to carry out his plan. But as I see it also, there's a compelling counter-argument here, which is that those industries need immigrant labor. The birth rate of the United States, like other Western nations, has been dropping precipitously. At the same time, we have a wave of baby boomers who are now fully accessing Social Security, our Social Security fund. And so you need a strong, vibrant labor force in the years to come more than ever. And all of that adds up to that if we're not careful and we make the border wall the symbol of our country instead of the Statue of Liberty, you're going to be begging people in the years to come to the United States. And I have a twin brother who's in politics, and every now and then he comes up with a line that I wish I had come up with. And he used to say that, Joaquin used to say that the scariest time for the United States will not be when everybody wants to come. It'll be when nobody wants to come. And with a person like Trump at the helm, he's accelerating that day for the United States.
Let me stick with you for a minute, Julián, because I am curious about that. Because Amnesty International has said that the right to seek asylum in the United States is non-existent at the US-Mexico border, in violation of its obligations, both national and international obligations. And I'm wondering, maybe I'm asking kind of an obvious question here, but do those international obligations register at all with the current administration?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, today we saw an example that the law of the United States itself and the ruling of a court is not registering with the administration when it comes to matters involving immigration. And so we have a constitutional crisis that now is at the doorstep of the United States. And we're going to figure out in short order whether people who should step up to check Trump's power are going to do that, or they're going to continue to be cowardly because they're afraid of losing their political position.
Yeah. Ayelet, where does that leave, the important international, I guess, legal framework governing the way, asylum seekers are treated around the world? I mean, where is it, where do they lie now? Do they mean anything?
I think they still do mean a lot, but I want to just first respond to Julián and to Peter on the demographic point. Sure. I think it's often made, and I think it's a very convincing point for policymakers. I think states have been exceptionally sophisticated in their way of dealing with migration, and they might well decide that they prefer to go for temporary migrant workers rather than permanent migrant workers. So we will see a cycling. So I think the demographic argument is vital, but I'm not 100% sure that the response would actually be that countries would welcome migrants in. I also want to remind ourselves that when we speak about migrants, we're actually talking about very, very different categories of individuals who are entering.
Yes.
In Canada, typically the bulk of permanent residents who enter the country are actually selected on the basis of their skill and economic ability. So Canada has for many, many years had the point system and various other mechanisms of ensuring that people who come in actually very swiftly can contribute to the economy. That's partly the reason why we had this consensus for so many years. People arrive on the basis of family reunification. Again, that's another value which all our countries share, and that is a very significant route of admission. And then we have the humanitarian causes. Actually, in Canada for years, it's a small category. It's roughly 10% of the intake per year. So with those categories, again, different countries have different regimes. Some people can get to the territory, as I mentioned, either to territorial waters or physically arrive to the territory. Then you can seek asylum. But the United States for many years used resettlement, right? People were already determined to have been refugees through the United Nations High Commissioner, et cetera. And then they got their admission to the United States already with the status determined. So there are many, many different ways. So I think international law is not out of the picture, but I do think our mechanisms are so antiquated because the current convention that we have is the 1951 Refugee Convention. That's the most, that's the refugee regime that we have. Yeah. It was designed for a particular era, right? This is post-World War II, post-Holocaust. It was actually specifically temporally limited for people up until 1951, and it was also regionally limited for Europe. It was supposed to have expired. We then had the 1967 protocol, which expanded the same convention globally. So our mechanism, so to speak, for asylum seeking is very, very antiquated. No one thought about climate refugees at the time. So we are really dealing, even the tools that we have are not the best tools.
Peter.
Well, over the last 60 years, Germany has experienced almost all different types of migration. Labor market migration in the 60s when people came from Turkey because we had a booming economy, humanitarian immigration, illegal immigration, all different types. And what we have learned as a lesson is that when you have migration, wanted or unwanted migration, you have to organize integration efforts and courses. You have to make sure that people will be in a decent command of your language. Otherwise, I cannot integrate in the labor market.
Peter, I have to interrupt. I'm so sorry because we've lost your microphone.
Oh.
If we just kind of stick that back on so we can hear you fully, that would be great.
Normally I can address audiences.
May I put it on, please? Okay. There we go. Forgive us for a moment here. Technical issues. Let's see. I can do this.
Thank you.
No problem. Just give me a moment. There we go. There we are. Please.
Thank you so
just
much.
Just wrap up that last point.
I was afraid you had turned off the micro because I was speaking too lengthy. No. Well, the lesson that we have learned is whatever type of migration you are dealing with, it is in the interest of your own country and in the interest of the migrant people to get integrated in the society where they permanently live.
Sure.
And that starts with the knowledge, with a decent command of our own language. It includes some understanding of our cultural and historical background. And astonishingly, it took us several decades before we adopted a law on integration of immigrants in 2015. That was the first time. But now it turns out that we managed to improve the integration even of people who were staying in Germany for 40 years and where the children and grandchildren were not in command of German language. And if you look around in Germany, we have admitted people from the different countries and we have tried to live up to our obligations, but our character, our cultural integrity has not been damaged. And that is an important thing. And I have understood that in Canada, many citizens are afraid, especially also the French-speaking community, that a massive arrival of new citizens without this integration could lead to problems for the local population itself. And in a country like Canada, where you have bigger country, but lesser population, smaller population than in Germany, France, or the UK, I think it is important to make sure that this integration aspect is not neglected.
I want to go back to, thank you for that, Peter. I want to go back to what you said, Ayelet, and just underline the numbers that we're talking about here. So according to the UNHCR in June of 2024, 122.6 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced. No doubt that's an understatement, plus the millions who are seeking a better life. And so, Julián and then Ayelet, I mean, what is a government to do in the face of an endless stream of asylum seekers arriving at the border? What is the top piece of advice that you would provide, Julián?
Number one, to stay true to your values. So whether there are a few people trying to come or a lot of people trying to come, you have to treat people humanely and compassionately and reasonably, consistently. Secondly, I think it's an argument for working for the United States, understanding that we're part of a neighborhood and that there are pressures of lack of economic opportunity, safety, climate, of other things that drive people to seek asylum, seek a new life in the United States. And so it's an argument for being proactive to work with our neighbors to try and ensure that people can find safety and opportunity and a good quality of life where they live. Yeah. Because I really believe people don't just pick up and go somewhere else and uproot their entire family and leave them. Bring their kids, but leave their extended family for no reason. I mean, they're compelled to do that. Yeah. And I think we have a greater role to play, not in paternalistically or condescendingly working with these countries, but in earnest working with them to create a better life for people.
Thank you.
So 3 quick points. First of all, Peter, Quebec, actually in Canada, immigration is a joint jurisdiction. So Quebec for years had an agreement with the federal government, still has, that people who come to Quebec actually need to have the linguistic capacity, or you get a plus if you speak French. So this is already integrated into our system, and it must actually. So that's just a point of fact, or just for everyone to know, this is not something that has not been contemplated. On the question of the numbers, that's my second point. If we're looking at climate, which we didn't get to yet,
we're
but
eventually,
okay. So you want me to speak to it now?
Well, you can, but we're maybe just address the bigger point.
I think the point that Julián made about our need to, the way I would put it is the problem is too large for any country to address it single-handedly, even the strongest country in the world, right? Even let's assume the US, which actually still has the highest number of migrants in the world, right? In terms of numbers of migrants who are in one country, the United States is still leading. It's impossible just given the pressures. We would need any future-oriented policy, I think, would require us to think about greater cooperation across nations. It might be regional, it might be global, it might be, we're not even sure how, there are different, I have a couple of ideas I can share with you, but I think that the long and short point is that it's just impossible to do this. Given the pressures and the future pressures, the only way we can really find a humane solution, a productive solution, one that migrants would have their voices as well as citizens in the recipient countries, would require us to be much more collaborative. And the concern that's the third point, that currently migration is so closely linked in our thinking to sovereignty that it becomes something that each nation upholds dearly. And we actually know that historically that's a very, very recent moment. It's really roughly late 19th century when we're seeing this association of control over the border in the sense of regulation of who gets in with questions of sovereignty. Historically, borders were actually mostly designed to ensure people don't leave rather than not enter. So this is actually, it's just that we take it for granted today. It has shifted in the past. I don't see any good reason why it wouldn't shift, and I think that's our only hope for a sustainable future is actually to have that.
Yeah. So
I agree with it, and in large parts. And nevertheless, when I visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, it's 30 years ago, and there was a picture of a ship full of German and European youth who left Germany after the beginning of the Nazi dictatorship in 1933, and they desperately tried to get accepted in the US, in other countries, and after 2 years, they returned back home to Germany, and almost all of them perished in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. And this was a failure of my country. And what is the lesson learned from that? The lesson learned, we have to control migration. But whenever somebody is in need to save his life and his mere and sheer existence, then we should recognize that humanity is also a category in politics. And we should live up to that responsibility, be it a Jew, be it a German, or be it somebody else from another country.
Yeah. We will now move to climate change, Ayelet, because as you say, it is a game-changing development in the field of human movement. And so I'm curious what you think. I mean, there have been reports that the Canadian government, for example, has studied the possibility of applying the principle of not returning people to a place where they may be harmed by climate events. I'm wondering how monumental a change to refugee policy you think that would be.
It would be monumental, no doubt, just because the numbers are just staggering. It's hard for us to even conceptualize them. There is a range of predictions. The lowest predictions are saying that we would have by 2050, so not too far, right? Something that we can see over the horizon, 25 years. The lowest estimates are that there would be 25 million people displaced by climate-induced reasons. The highest projections are 1.2 billion. I think the IOM, which is the International Organization of Migration, estimates moderately between 200 and 300 million people will be displaced. Now, usually the story is that people usually first move internally within a country. If they can't find either safe land or some kind of a sustainable future, they would cross an international border. Let's assume we're looking at that moderate estimate of 200 to 300 million migrants. I didn't do this, I usually do this with every room, but if I had asked you what's the number of migrants in the world, I'm betting, based on my past experience, that people would say something like 1 billion or 2 billion. The current number is actually between 200 and 300 million migrants internationally. That means we would have, under the more moderate estimation, a double of that number.
Wow.
Now, we spoke about 2015, 1.2, 1.5 million entered a country of 80 million. We're still feeling the ramifications 10 years later. more restrictive. What are we going to do? And I think there are two scenarios. One to me is the frightening one, the dystopian one. We will see just the story of restriction in such a way that countries would just really wall themselves off, maybe use live ammunition to shoot people, right? That would be sort of the worst case scenario. I think a more optimistic scenario would be that at some point we would just catch ourselves, realize that this is happening. These are Earth systems. It's no longer in our hands. We would have to collaborate, and if we can find a peaceful way to actually respect humanity, respect the basic dignity of the individuals who need to move. And I agree with Julián, people don't want to move. Actually, people are now fighting in some of the Pacific islands that are drowning. People are claiming a right not to leave. It's the reverse. They're not asking to go. They don't want to move. They're actually seeking still mitigation so they could stay in their home countries. So that's the future, and it's a very different future from the current reality.
Julián, could you address just how you see the question of responsibility changes when we talk about climate change, especially given what we all know, which is it is, Western countries that lead, so to speak, in the, greenhouse gas emissions and leading to the climate change crisis that we're in?
The United States, of course, accounts for a disproportionate amount of the world's emissions and has, compared to other countries, exacerbated climate change. And I believe, in part because of that the U.S. has a particular responsibility to help address it, even as it includes climate refugees. And so I think setting aside a category of the ability to take people in who are experiencing essentially an uprooting of their quality of life and their ability to exist where they're at because of climate change makes sense in the future. And we know that militaries around the world have studied this, that the United States military and governments have studied it. It is a reality. I wish that right now I could say that we're going in the right direction. Like with everything else just about in the country, we're going in the opposite direction,
right.
Including scaling back from our commitments that were part of the Paris Climate Accords and so forth. And so we're going to have a lot of catching up to do in the years ahead.
Peter, does climate change or the responsibility related to climate change, could that change the conversation in Germany about migration?
I don't think so, because I'm deeply convinced that we will never ever be in a position to accommodate all the people suffering from climate change. The only chance we have is to slow down climate change and to prevent climate change in the future. The second thing that is perhaps underestimated but directly linked to climate change is demographic growth of population. A country like Niger, not Nigeria, Niger. It's a very poor country, a small country. They have 19 million people, average age is 14, and the population will grow within the next couple of decades to 100 million people. And the question is, in what way or the other can we enable these people to deal with climate change in their country? And how can we give them access to education in their country via the internet and modern tools? Otherwise, many of them will become, for desperation, illegal migrants, desperately trying to find a safe haven elsewhere in the world. And therefore, we have a responsibility to have a dialogue with these countries. Europe perhaps has a higher responsibility because we are closer neighbors. You have a closer neighborhood with South American countries, but it is not something that can be left to the local politicians in these countries alone. Otherwise, it would have devastating consequences for all other countries in the world as well.
We're getting close to the end here, but before we kind of wrap up this round, Ayelet, I want to ask you this. Migration is already a privilege of the people of the global north. And we've talked at length about the challenges to opening borders and this sort of ever-expanding reach of borders and immigration controls. I wonder what you think that means in a world where inequality between haves and have-nots is starker than ever.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest and hardest questions. I think I would want to say that indeed, immigration and even citizenship actually tracks to privilege, right? So probably many people in the room might have just been born in Canada, and that's probably one of the greatest gifts that you have ever been given, right? So citizenship and migration definitely are connected to questions of global inequality. How to address them. Migration might be part of it. I think traditionally the answer that people who are doing development would actually echo my two co-panelists, make sure that people have a chance at home to improve their life there. I do think that certain countries have much stronger obligations towards other countries, just given their historical links. So it could be that, say, the UK has greater obligations towards its former colonies, et cetera. So we might need to wrap this up actually with the discussion about climate change. We might need to connect it to discussions about reparations. And human mobility will be one element, but not the sole element. And I think partly I do want to emphasize the point that Julián mentioned. We actually know that most people don't want to leave. It's exceptionally hard to immigrate. People usually lose status. It's their children that gain the benefits. It's exceptionally difficult to start a new life in a new society. So we often think about the hardships that might fall on the recipient country. And indeed, when we're talking about, say, limited infrastructure, Brazil, for example, accepted many people from Venezuela, but at some point people just said, look, we don't have anything. Our sewage systems are overflowing. It's just a structural limit. Help us. So I think that's a fair claim. And in Brazil, they did something very smart. People were coming up through the north. They moved them to the south, which happens to be some of the richer states in Brazil. It's a large federal country. So there might be internal mechanisms. But I think globally, as I said, we'll need more cooperation. But I think we also will need to face the fact that there are deep justice issues that really need to be addressed. And that might require the richer countries, if they want to maintain control over their borders, it also might entail that there's just a greater responsibility also beyond our borders, not just for the people who arrive, but actually to people who might wish to come in. And if we can find a way for them to have a great life in their home country or somewhere else, that might be at least an option that should be considered.
So the stakes, as you've all outlined, couldn't be higher right now, and they're quite literally a matter of life and death. Who gets to come in, who gets to stay, and who doesn't, and who gets to decide. So the title of our discussion that we've been having is Reimagining Borders. So to end off, I want to ask each of you the image that comes to mind when I ask you to reimagine borders in the 21st century. Peter, and then Ayelet and Julián. Peter.
Borders will ever exist, but she mustn't be scary for people in need, and she must be protective for the local population in the country concerned. This can be achieved only together. And if I see how dense the tensions are between the US and Canada now, what is a pity because we are the Western countries and Western values, but let's pool together our ideas and our thoughts to shape something that maintains border but allows humanity as well where it is justified. And I think this would be a signal not only to the outside world, but also to our friends in the United States. In the United States, people are deeply divided, and many are asking questions and get no answers. And therefore, we owe so much also to you in the US, and we should make sure that the Western values that made us strong will survive in a modern world in the future.
Well, that's beautiful. I think we usually think about borders as walls. I want to give you other images. We know that between the US and Canada, we started with the US, Julián is going to speak in a minute, we have different ways of thinking about the border. There's the International Peace Park, right, which is North Dakota and Manitoba. It's actually, you can enter from both sides of the border, and it's a peaceful place. People congregate for music, to interact, to think together. So that's a very different image. It's full of flowers. It's a totally different atmosphere of how the two countries interact. I want to remind people in the audience, Gander, do you remember post 9/11 when the US airspace was closed? A tiny, tiny town of less than 10,000 people had almost 40 flights diverted there, and people opened their heart. They gave everything everything to the people who came in. That's a good neighbor. And I think especially at a time of which was, of course, an extreme moment, I don't think people thought for a minute. That, to me, is a different image of a border. And the last thing I would say is just a quote from one of my favorite poets, Robert Frost, which is to say, good fences make good borders. And that might be sort of our thought for today, that maybe that's the way to actually maintain the integrity of both sides, but also to make sure that we can communicate and interact across these borders and be there if there's a time of need.
Julián, what do you imagine?
Yeah, I think of borders as less of a militaristic kind of dividing line and more as like the relationship between neighbors that are friendly, and the gate that exists, but where neighbors can visit each other and share a relationship, and often share, a history and a culture and a way of being with each other that adds to both of their lives. At a societal level, at a national level, that's how I think of what our border should be. There's an order to it, and there is a marker and a way to control it, but it's based more in friendship and an aspiration and a community than it is in a division.
Beautiful image. Julián, Ayelet, and Peter, thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it tonight. Thank you.
Time is up.
We're exactly on time.
As interim director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, I want to personally thank Julián Castro, Peter Altmaier, and Ayelet Shachar for all of their insights this evening, and Nahlah Ayed from CBC Ideas for her excellent questions and moderation. I would also like to recognize the rest of the CBC team involved in the second edition of Conversations, as well as MISC staff, its board, and the advisory committee for this event. Thank you to the McGill leadership, including the president, the provost, and the dean of arts, as well as to McGill Multimedia Services. Merci également à CEPAC, au Centre Montréal, à CCL Solutions, et finalement à Avenue Strategic Communications. The new Conversations series only exists because of the vision and commitment of philanthropist Charles Bronfman. I thank Mr. Bronfman for his insight and generosity, without which this new series, and more generally MISC, would not exist in the first place. Merci à Monsieur Bronfman. We heard tonight that borders are currently a fundamental part of territorial sovereignty. The current international order guarantees states the right to control movement across their borders. We also heard tonight that states face immense challenges in managing borders in a way that balances demands for control and protectionism with commitments to human rights. The challenge of striking this balance is even greater in the current climate of fear about access to resources like health care, fear about climate change, fear about the economy, which makes it easy for populist and right-wing parties to scapegoat migrants and weaponize migration for political gain. A key goal of the Conversations is to think about Canada's place in the world and its capacity for leadership. We might be the only high-income country that has run a mass immigration system and created a multicultural nation without the kind of xenophobic backlash seen now in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, and elsewhere. I hope that former Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Mark Miller, is correct, the person you quoted, that we will find a way to continue leading by example, by being, as he said, firm, fair, and absolutely not being cruel, and that we will do so, as in the words of Julián Castro, by staying true to our values. Merci beaucoup d'être venus nombreux aujourd'hui et bonne fin de soirée à tous. Thank you very much for attending our conversation today, and have a great evening. Goodbye.